I'm George Ure, and with me is Cliff High. This is a report from the Fifth Order House. As you know, we've been messing about with the Rickety Time Machine, also called WebBot Project, since about the middle of 2001, well in advance of the 9/11 events. Cliff, a lot of people are asking me, what is this Fifth Order House stuff we're doing?
There has to be a replacement for the systems that we see failing around us all over. There's no reason for us to sit around and wait for someone else to invent appropriate replacements. So George and I are attempting to begin looking at new methods of life, modus via, as opposed to framing it in something so colloquial as a business model. But out of that, the Fifth Order House is basically a business model, a new way of doing business. The idea is to be energy nexus points and redirector points and take off enough in the process to meet sufficiency, and then everything else passes through us to other projects that will multiply. And basically, it's on the same order of thinking that the military uses in the idea of a force multiplier. So the idea that every dollar we spend locally has that much more impact on our lives locally than every dollar we ship out in the form of paying mortgages and so on, as Catherine Austin Fitts would say, is a core concept of what we're doing here. And basically, our idea is to get as much money flowing through our hands into others as we possibly can. And hopefully we'll get so much flowing that the government will collapse.
Well, speaking of which, in the process of working on some of the business model aspects of what a Fifth Order House is, and I wrote about this in Peoplenomics this week, I'm a little bit disturbed that governments tend to be really fourth order organizations. They put tripwires in place, almost like they don't want the next generation of business to come along. And they do that through a combination of things, but primarily tax policies and so forth. Can we really get around that?
We have to, because the government is essentially failing. I've come to the conclusion, let me start with an observation. Over the years, I've noticed that there are third and fourth order beings all around us on this planet, and yet we are not fourth order beings or third order beings, we're fifth order. And by that I mean a third order being might be an amoeba, where all amoebas on the planet are essentially the amoeba that we all started with. A fourth order being might be basically chickens. All chickens are fundamentally alike, all cockroaches are fundamentally alike, all octopi and so on. It's only when you get up to a certain level of organization in the body that you start getting individual differentiation. And that's what we mean by fifth order. So a fourth order being are like insects, where essentially they're all stamped from the same mold. The amount of variance is very small. And for instance, dogs used to be this way. They were basically this little ubiquitous 30-pound mongrel dog that was all over the whole planet until humans got in there and started mucking about with the DNA. And now we have the plethora of basically subspecies of dogs that we've got. Those are all examples of fifth order thinking where we get individual differentiation. So fourth order thinking would be government en masse, broadcast media, mass mailings, all of that kind of thing where it's done in order to gain an order of efficiency in the handling of the source material. And that's really what it is all about, is that they can handle a lot of source material by very few hands with this order of thinking and efficiency. And what we're doing is we're reversing that. Our order of thinking is fifth order, where we want to have the most possible, or we want to create an environment where the amount of complexity that is available can multiply should it decide it wants to. So basically we're in the business of complexification and supporting and preserving that. Governments unfortunately are not. So I, for one, don't intend to allow myself to be limited by the fourth order thinking of government in how we run the fifth order house. We will pay taxes and be legal as long as any of that is meaningful. Which I don't suspect is going to be that much longer. But we won't allow their thinking to decide who we give money to or how much of it we give away. The fact that the governments are limited in their thinking to 50% is their problem, not ours.
One of the things that comes to mind then is at what point does a business model that is organized not around making the rich richer, but is organized around redistributing wealth from the middle class to the lower class, can government really put up with such a thing? And aren't we really kind of going off, I won't say economic terrorism, but it would have to scare the hell out of people.
It probably will at their level. We're not the economic terrorists. We're basically tribalists in a sort of a weird sense, because we're working at a tribal level. Our reach will probably never hit the millions and millions of people that the government will, but the understanding that we can have in the experiment that we're attempting here, indeed, I think, is revolutionary in that sense. It is against the self-aggrandizing and self-supporting nature of government explicitly. And we start off that way. So we're probably doomed to failure, but that's good. We've got nowhere to go but up.
Changing topics, something else that I've been getting a lot of emails at the urbansurvival.com website is, okay, is this period coming up in March the thing that you and I were talking about in the Alta reports, 3-4 years ago, the big data gap of 2012, 2013? And if it is it nuclear war? Is it a complete meltdown of civilization? What is it?
We don't know we don't know how it will choose to manifest. We do know that this is basically it, that our data gap, which hit about this time and has refined over these past couple of years down to this point of March 2nd through 9th, that period is a key nexus point for whatever reason in time, and we're going to go through it. How it's going to express is anybody's guess, but there are some very nasty things that are mounting up out there, and if one is a trends forecaster, one looks at what's available to potentially participate in a trend. And one thing that is staggering is that last year, 2011, we had very, very few days without sunspots, very few clear sun days, and that has ramped up tremendously since 2009. It's ramping up even now. So I'm certain that the military and NASA's fear about solar activity, which was actually also suggested in some of the Maya material that was not part of the long count, but rather just their understanding of sunspot cycles, I'm certain that that's going to participate in what humanity has to go through in 2012 and 2013. To what extent and where it's going to hit is anybody's guess at this point. It may be calculable if one had the time and the energy to sit down and plot the rotation of the planet relative to the sun and certain indicators as to when it's going to be throwing these things off. So far we've been lucky, but I don't expect that to continue.
When you look at the data, and I know you're working on the long-term values now, when you look back at March, could it be something as simple, and it won't be simple of course, but as basic as the whole world finally running out of the last fool to get to invest in dollars, euros, paper abstractions, CDSs, all the rest of it? I mean, is it compound interest going to get our butt?
That happens in March, and may actually even be occurring slightly before that. Our problem is the following: that when I look from the data, when I isolate all the long-term data and look back at this point, there is I'm seeing basically the data gap from the other side. So from May of 2013 back to March, there's very little detail for me to go on. I have a lot of summation values I can pull out based on how the long-term data stacks up at the archetype level, but I don't have much in the way of data details. We do know that there is there were basically 9 scenarios that I laid out that could account for a slip into release language, any one of which taken to an extreme would account. So in other words, if we had an extreme enough solar flare, then it could trip us into release language that would continue in perpetuity. So could a nuclear war with Iran, So could a global economic meltdown if it was severe and fast enough and long-lasting enough, and so on. It may be that it is none of these 9 at an extreme level, but all of these 9 at some other level within them, and that may be that that level fluctuates over time. We don't really know at this stage. What we can say for sure, though, is that looking at it from the viewpoint of 2020 back to 2012, we see that the financial system and its owners, the Rothschilds, who claim at this point over 57.61% of all the wealth on the planet, and the Rockefellers, as the owners of the global financial system, that's when their demise begins. So from our viewpoint of looking back from 2020, by the time we reach the end of the data gap, where data starts rolling back in at some level in 2013, most of the damage has been done to the global financial system such that it is not functioning at that point.
Is there any way we can get a handle on how many people will be around then?
No. The data that originally specified that we were going to lose 1.289 billion people, you have to understand that's how that we actually screen away from all the numeric references, and that came up in a textual fashion, and those arise spontaneously, so we can't go looking for such. And also bear in mind, that's a detail-oriented thing, those kind of explicit references. So for instance, on the power, you remember the power hit in the Northeast?
Sure.
Right. The amazing level of detail we had describing, the grates in the railroad yard and where the lights were positioned and all of that you and I talked about for a long time.
Power flows to the south and
all of that. Right.
Yeah, all of that archive stuff about the abandoned city look of the transformer yard.
Yeah, all of that comes from the detail level, and it arises on its own. We can't really do anything to mine that very much. However, our 50H approach here of doing these is basically going to attempt to do that at some small level, because what we're going to do is attempt to run through as much of the immediacy data as we can in these reports before we hit this March discontinuity. It may be that we can continue after that, but I don't have any guarantee of that, so I kind of want to burn up what data we've got and do as much of the work as we can prior to hitting the discontinuity, because it may be discontinuous enough to also take down our source material or delivery mechanism.
So in the meantime, what do you do? I mean, I know you're out building grow domes, right?
Correct. Actually, we're assembling one today, and I have to apologize. I should have remembered that we were supposed to go off at noon my time, but we were so enthralled with how easily and well the domes were going that we just got caught up in it. And I totally spaced out on it because I'm not wearing the watch and stuff. But yeah, I'm building domes here because I am quite certain that solar radiation is a long-term issue we have to deal with, especially with food supply. And we now know that Fukushima is long-term radiation that we also have to deal with relative to food supply, especially up here in the Northwest. And so the grow domes allow me to cover the greatest amount of space outside for the least amount of dollars, and also allow me, as a side effect of that, to moderate the temperature and control the environment such that I can grow biointensively in a very nicely contained, easily maintained space.
One last question. Will there be a written report, or should we just go with these oral reports for now?
Now, I'm in the process of finishing up the written long-term report, but it's not a shape report. It's going to be called a future recent history report, because it is different, because it doesn't have the detail, doesn't have the shorter term values, and a lot of it is guessing from the long-term values looking backwards. That we're still going to work for another regular shape report, but waiting through the immediacy values is going to be a huge amount of trouble to get at the shorter and longer term, and in the meantime we might as well use those immediacy values as we go along. So I'm actually not expecting another shape report until around the time of the discontinuity at the earliest.
Well, that's it for now. We're going to keep the price of these reports at a ridiculously low $3. So for now, I'm George. He's...
I'm Cliff. And also one other thing, we will let these reports, when the data is stale, they'll go for free.
Produced by a Fifth Order House.